Look at this picture. It didn't come out. It's too dark. What a shame. Well, here's another one. This is much too light. This one didn't come out either. Here's one that's too fuzzy. Here's one that's out of focus, too blurry. Gee. And here's one that's too dark again. They're no good. These pictures didn't come out. These are pictures that were out of control. They had no control to them. Well, here's a picture I do like. This is a photograph of my grandmother and myself. She gave the camera to, she was an avid snap shooter, and she gave her camera to someone on the street and said, take our picture. And they did. My grandmother always carries a camera with her, and it's a camera like this. It's a very simple kind of camera. And one day she wanted to photograph a sunset, one of those very dim, beautiful ones. And she put the camera to her eye, and she went like this and then said, wait a minute, there's not enough light to make a picture. I need more light. I'll have to add more light. So she took a flash like this, put it in the camera, got it set, and fired. Well, of course, she didn't get her picture. I'm afraid all she got was that. Like these pictures here, this picture was out of control. There just wasn't enough light. Now, what was the problem? Well, let's look first at her camera. Her camera really is one of these very nice, simple cameras that a lot of people use. It's a camera like most other cameras in a way. It has a lens, it has a shutter button, has a place to wind it, has a place to put the flash, and it has a place to look through it. What it doesn't have is adjustments. Now, they may be fun and they may be cheap and they may be easy to use, but when you get out of sunlight and you don't have the flash, what do? Well, that's a problem. A lot of these cameras are usually used for snapshots, and in most of those snapshots, it's up to the subject to be interesting or to be funny or to be amusing or entertaining. What about that sunset again? My feeling is that if my grandmother had had a camera she could control, something that allowed her to make allowances for the low light, she could have gotten that picture that got away. She needed a camera, something like this. She needed a camera that had controls. Now, this camera has the three major controls that we're going to talk about today, that any good adjustable camera should have. What are they? They are the focus, the aperture, and the shutter control. First, let's talk about the focus. What is focus? Maybe it's better to ask, what does out of focus look like? And that's what out of focus looks like. Now, just like this particular camera, the television cameraman here, he also has a focus control to make me sharp or unsharp at his will. He can do it as he pleases. Before I go any further and tell you how the focus really works, come on over here and let me show you what it does, because focus is really a beautiful control. Here's a picture of a teacup. It's not just a teacup, of course, it's other things in the picture, but they're all out of focus. Why? Because I focused only on the cup. I had a camera that allowed me to focus at that close distance, which was about 2 feet. Going on, there's, well, see now I shifted the focus, and you can see that only the fruit was the part of the picture I was most interested in. The focus allowed me to put the sharpness where the interest was. The cup is no longer interesting, but it's still there, sort of. And in the background now I see somebody else. And who is that? Aha! It's a guy reading a newspaper in the morning, watching me take his picture. Now he's the chief interest, and the fruit and the cup are both out of focus. Now I didn't move the camera, I didn't move myself, I didn't move anything but the focus control. It was only the focus that changed. I was able to put the sharpness where the interest was. Now, if that didn't convince you, let me show you some prints that I think really show how important focus can be to the success of a photograph. Look at this. Here's a photograph of a man. He was sitting in a restaurant across the table from me, about almost as close as that cup was, but not quite. I was able to just concentrate on him, and at the right moment I snapped his picture. He was looking off to the side. The focus control made this picture possible. Here's another one. Here's a picture of some roses. Well, these roses, they were, I wasn't interested in the box they were in, but only the roses and the blue paper they were wrapped in. I felt that looked very nice. I closed in as close as I could with my focus control on the camera, and when I got this close, I snapped the picture. Now that I've shown you what it does, let me show you how it works. take a shoebox, any shoebox, and throw away the lid. Cut a hole in the front, put a white piece of paper in the back, and you have something which is an awful lot like a basic camera. Now, what I'm going to do is show you how focus works, but first, you see, I want to do something on this light bulb here. Now, this light bulb is going to be our subject, and I'm going to draw an arrow on it facing up. Now, in the real world, when you're photographing, you're really photographing light reflecting off of subjects, but in our case, I'm going to use light as the subject itself. Turn on the light, get a magnifying lens, a common desk magnifier. You can do this yourself at home, and when I bring the magnifier into just the right position, I can get a sharp picture of that arrow, a sharp picture of the arrow. And if I change the position, I can reestablish the focus, say if I move the shoebox. Moving the lens allows me to change the focus, okay? That's very, very important. And the focus control on a camera works pretty much the same way. There's a focusing ring, and it allows you to focus on objects near or far. Now, you probably noticed that the image was upside down. Why is that? Okay, come on over here. The light bulb was emitting light in all directions, like this. However, it was only the light from the front of the bulb facing the lens that produced an image here in the back of the camera. The light that was coming from the top part of the bulb, I should say, light only travels in straight lines, which is what makes this possible. The light coming from the top of the bulb went through the lens, through the box, and wound up there. And from the bottom of the bulb, the light coming from here went also through the lens to there. And all the light rays from all the different parts did the same. They went to the opposite end of the box upside down. That's basically how the focus works. On a camera, what really happens is, as you move the lens, you can actually see it go in and out, just like I move the lens on the box. The further away I can get it from the film, the closer I can get to something, and this control, again, basically allows you to put the sharpness where the interest is. That's the key use of the focus control. The better cameras help you to do this with a mechanical system. In this one, when you look through it, like this, gee, I'm photographing you and all I see is a blob, a blur, but as I turn the focus control, I suddenly see you come into focus. When I see your image sharp in the finder, it'll also, and then I take the picture, it'll also be sharp on the film. That's what's really important. Now, other cameras help you do this in other ways. For example, look at this camera. This camera is a rangefinder camera, and it has a little window here that you sight through to focus. Now, when you look through the finder, gee, I see the image just like in a normal camera, but then in the center I see a secondary image that moves back and forth. It's the same subject, but it moves back and forth as I move this control. When I turn the control, I bring that secondary image into the same position as the first image. When the two images coincide, say if it's your face and I see one face instead of two, that subject at that distance will be sharp. Now, on a simple camera, such as this, well, this is a camera that doesn't give you a mechanical system to help you focus, but it does print a bunch of numbers. The manufacturers have printed some numbers on the lens, 4 feet, 6 feet, 10 feet, and what your job is really to estimate the distance and then set it on the lens. Now, if, for example, sometimes people have a hard time figuring out how far something is to make that adjustment, how tall are you? Imagine your height lying down. Supposing that a group of people were 3 times your height lying down on the ground, set it to that. If you were 6 feet, that would be 6, 12, 18 feet away. Set the lens for 18 feet. That subject will be sharp at that distance. Remember, the focus control in all of these cameras allows you to put the sharpness where the interest is. Okay. Enough for focus. Let's move on to the aperture. Aperture control of the camera. Now, my grandmother, she could have gotten that sunset in that low light if she had had an aperture control. That's really all she needed, I think, is an aperture control. Before I show you how it works, let me again show you the results it produces in a picture. Come on over here. Remember this picture? This is a picture that had gotten away. It was too dark. There was not enough light reaching the film. This is what it could have looked like. In fact, this is what it now looks like. And the control that made this possible was the aperture control. It's what really made the significant difference. It allowed more light to reach the film. The aperture control basically is a controller of light. It either prevents too much or allows enough light to hit the film. Now, let's show, let me show you some more prints, I think, that really show how this can produce nice results. Look at this. Here's a print taken on a winter day, very dark outside. In fact, it was darker than that print looks. This picture was made by Frank Seidman using a camera that had an aperture control. He was able to allow more light via the control to expose the picture. Here is another photograph, which I took at a party where the light was very dim, and I just used the biggest possible aperture to allow as much light to hit the film as possible, and it produced this picture. Very nice girl. Very dark area. It allowed me to take that picture. And the last one, which is really my favorite of the three, shows a girl sitting by a window, and it's just dimly lit, and only the aperture could have allowed me to take this. Now that I've shown you the result it can produce in a picture, let me show you how it works. Here's a camera lens. Here's a camera lens that has an aperture control built into it, and you can see it working a little bit like this. Here's a lever on the side that operates it called the aperture control, and as I go back and forth, it makes the aperture diameter either smaller or larger. The aperture refers to the opening, okay? It refers to the opening. Now when I take this lens, self-same lens, and I bring it to the shoebox, and I turn on the light, why, I'm able to see the arrow again, right? Now supposing that this looks awful dim, doesn't it? It's hard to see that. Well, just let me open up the aperture here, and I'll allow in more light. See that? It got brighter. And then if I want to make it darker, I can take the control the other way. I'm cutting back the amount of light that hits the film via the aperture control. Now, there's a simple way to understand its function, I think, and it's just imagine yourself coming from a dark theater into a very bright daylight situation. What's your first response? You squint. You squint. Your idea is to try to stop the light from hitting your eyes because, in fact, it's too bright. And the aperture on a camera works an awful lot like that squinting action on your eyes. The idea is it stops the light. And on apertures, the brighter the subject generally, the smaller that aperture has to be, and vice versa. Now, my grandmother's camera, alas and alack, has no aperture control. Its aperture is fixed at the time of manufacture to a setting which only makes it good for bright daylight conditions. You need a camera like this that has an adjustable aperture. Now, here are the numbers, right here. Well, here's the control ring for the aperture, and on it are written numbers like 2, 2, 8, 4. We call those F numbers, very important. And the reason why they're called F is Latin, well, it stands for fenestra. Fenestra is Latin for window. The aperture is like the window to the film. If you look at the numbers, you'll notice that they go from a relatively low number, 2, to 16, F16. Now, the smaller the aperture, the smaller the aperture, you'll find the larger the number that designates it. And the larger the aperture, the smaller the number that designates it. The largest opening, we have F2. Why is that? Why is that? Come on over here and let me show you. Here's a drawing of a bunch of apertures going from widest to smallest, from F2 to F16. 16 being the smallest aperture, 16 stands for a fraction. It's not just a number by itself, it stands for a fraction. 1/16. It's a measurement. And the wider ones, say like 1/8, stand for larger fractions. So you can see that as you go down from F16 to F8 to, say, F2, you're dealing with a number which designates a wider and larger aperture on the lens. Now, these numbers are called f-stops. Why do we call them stops? Well, that's simple. As you close the f-stop control down to the smaller aperture, you're in effect stopping the light. So we write it f stop, like that. Now, the aperture control is only one of the two light controls on a camera. The second one is the shutter. The aperture controls how large the opening is that the light comes through. The shutter control controls how much time that light takes to reach the film. When you use the aperture control and the shutter control together in the right way, in effect, that's what gives you your proper exposure. Now, although the shutter is primarily a control for light, the shutter can make a tremendous difference in the appearance of your pictures if you're dealing with active subjects, moving subjects, and I have some slides I'd like to show which show that, I think, quite well. Come on over here and look at this. Here's a photograph of a couple of runners, a couple of joggers, and you can hardly see them. Why? They were photographed at 1/4 of a second. That's a very long exposure, and they are a total blur. The next photograph of them was made at 1/60th of a second, which is a little bit closer to the shutter speed you'd be likely to find on a simple camera. They are still blurry, but you can see that they're runners. The next picture was shot at a 500th of a second shutter speed, and the picture is so sharp as a result of that high shutter speed that you can practically count the young lady's teeth. I myself, though, prefer not so much the sharp picture, but a picture that shows motion, blur, energy, color, a picture such as this one. This kind of picture is a bit more interesting to me. If that doesn't convince you, let me show you some really knockout prints where the shutter was very important to the final outcome of the picture. Look at this. Here's a picture that was made by Frank Seitman of a few people sitting on a hill on a very windy day, and he saw that the hair was flying about, and he wanted to freeze that hair into a very nice image, and so he set the camera to 500th of a second and made this picture. Very, very beautiful photograph, and the shutter contributed to the freezing of the hair. In another picture, well, this one was made really at a much longer shutter speed, at 30th of a second, and while these figures were running, these Groucho Marx imitators, I was running alongside with them and snapped the shutter and showed the picture as a result shows lots of movement. You can still see them rather sharply, but not totally sharply. Your set isn't at fault if you can't see this clearly. This is how I made this picture. The slow shutter speed allowed me to get this particular variation on it. Here are two photographs which I'd like to show you together of a horse and a rider. The one on the left was made at a very high shutter speed, and the one at the right was made at a very slow shutter speed, and they're both good photographs. How does a shutter work? Well, a shutter is a little bit like a window, or in fact a window shutter in front of the film. What it does is it opens and closes at the moment you press the shutter button. Opens and closes. When it's closed, there's no light reaching the film. It opens fast and then closes. Basically, that's what it does. I'd like to use the shoebox again to show you what the shutter speeds really look like as the light hits the film. Now, we come back and use the same lens. I'll open up to wide aperture so we can see it easily, and I will set this lens at a 1-second shutter speed to show you what that looks like. First, I blank out the film, like that, and then I fire the lens at a second. There it is. That's 1 second. If I set it to a higher shutter speed, which is the kind of shutter speed we'd probably use in most shooting situations, well, that would look a little bit more like this. Blink. I'll do that again. Blink like that. Or we can shoot a long time exposure if we like this. Now, doesn't that show? Try that again. A long exposure, giving us a time exposure. Well, most of the speeds that we're likely to use in a camera are actually very fast speeds. They're fractions of a second. They're very fast fractions of a second, usually like 125th or 250th of a second. My grandmother's camera doesn't have any such control for the shutter speed. Well, it's set for daylight at about a 90th of a second, and it always goes off at the same speed when you fire it. The adjustable camera has a whole range of shutter speeds. Look, here's 1 second. Well, here's an 1/8 of a second. Here's a 15th. Here's a 500th of a second. And if you look at the dial, just wrestle with this thing here. If you look at the dial where the shutter speeds are shown, you'll see a series of numbers going from, in this case, 1, which would be 1 second, up through the higher, larger numbers to 15, which merely means 15th of a second. These are fractions, just like on the lens, just like in the aperture, I mean. These are fractions. Go up to 60th of a second, 250th, a 500th of a second. These are fractions of seconds. The larger the number, the higher the speed. Okay? What does that really mean in terms of exposure? Well, let's go back to the chart. This bar, this shows a 1 second exposure. 1 second, that long. Half a second, well, that's exactly half the length. When the shutter is open for half a second, it effectively cuts the time in half that the light takes to reach the film. If we go down to a 1/4 of a second, well, that's half again what the half a second was. Most exposures are usually, though, taken down here at a 60th of a second, 125th of a second, 250th. Each of these speeds lets in, as we go up, half as much light as the speed before it. Each time, each stop, each of these we call a stop, also like on the lens. If you go from 125 to a 60th, you're doubling the time. If you go from a 60th back to 125th, you cut the time back in half. Now, how do you set these exposures? In the future, I'm going to talk about light meters, but for the moment, what you should do is save the instruction sheet that comes with your box of film. Here's a box of film. And here's the instruction sheet. And the instruction sheet basically gives you a range of exposures for several different quantities of daylight, from very bright to open shade. Now, the average daylight exposure, it says, it recommends, is 125th of a second at f11. I'll set that on this camera. 125th of a second at f11. There's a little red diamond, that's our pointer. Now, supposing I really preferred to shoot a runner at very high speed, and I needed to shoot him at a 500th of a second and not at 125th. Well, I would move from 125th to 250th, which is 1 stop, to a 500th, which is 2 stops away. I'd be cutting the light hitting the film by 2 stops. What do? I have to open the aperture control the same amount to a larger aperture, which in this case, going from f11, I would open to f8, to then a larger aperture of f5.6, letting more light in. Remember, when you move the shutter speed 1 stop faster, you have to move the aperture control 1 stop larger. Very important. That's what basically the understanding of exposure is about. Maybe this will help you to understand these numbers a little bit better too. On the shutter speed dial, the higher the numbers are, the faster the shutter speed it stands for. And on the aperture control ring, the lower the number, the larger the aperture. Very important. The lower the number, the larger the aperture. When you move to the higher numbered shutter speeds, you move the lower number. When you move to a higher shutter speed, supposing you wanted to change the effect of the picture but not the basic exposure, if you move one up, the shutter speed, you have to move the aperture to an enlarged position and a lower aperture number. Very important. Well, that's basically it for exposure. I'll be covering it again in other shows, but that's basically it for now. Before we end, I'd like to show you several prints. Now, these are photographs that were made by friends of mine, and they really are photographs which could not have been made without the help of these several controls. Look at the first print. first print is a man sitting in a bar. Well, it's very red, it's very bright, and you begin to realize just how long this exposure was made when you see that this figure here is almost a ghost. So maybe the exposure was 2 or 3 seconds long. Fortunately, the man was sitting still. It's a very interesting and very bizarre photograph. It could not have been made without a shutter speed control. Here's another one. Well, this is Frank's picture of Orson Welles. Orson Welles, terrific filmmaker, very brooding, deep kind of character, and he took a photograph which matches Welles's sort of, qualities that he emulates. The situation, though, for the photography was a very dark theater where he was talking, and he had to open up to a very wide aperture, f2, and a very slow shutter speed, a 30th of a second, in order to get this particular picture. I love it. I think it's a fascinating photograph of Welles. Very deep, very dark. The next photograph was made by Donald Dietz. Donald Dietz is very fascinated with movement in pictures, and he often takes advantage of the longer shutter speeds inherent, built into his camera to get pictures that he likes. He never shoots a sharp picture. Look at this. He was standing at a crossing along with this lady and her bicycle, and suddenly this train whizzed by. Well, there's all this movement. The forms fell into place for him suddenly, and he shot the picture. It was so dark that he had to use a very long shutter speed, but I'm sure that he would have used such a shutter speed anyway. Probably it was 1/8 of a second, maybe 1/4 of a second. Probably the lens was wide open. He's holding it for dear life, as steady as he possibly can. Whiz, that train just whizzes by. The movement in this picture is really the subject of the picture. And it's sort of bizarre and dark and very nice, and I like it quite a bit. Look at this last picture here. Well, this one's by Donald Dietz too, and it's a picture of a somewhat different kind. This is really the St. Louis Arch, this band of light here, and this is a tree. Obviously it's a tree, and it's moving, it's blurry. He probably photographed this at about 1/15th of a second on a very stormy or windy day, holding the camera steady so the arch would be sharp. It was the control of the camera which allowed him to get the particular picture that he wanted to get. It's the control of the camera which will allow you to get pictures that used to get away. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.